In this video, we're going to have a look at how to use a checklist when disputing a consumer serious credit infringement. So basically, what a serious credit infringement is, it's a more serious type of listing that suggests a credit provider is under the impression that the person has deliberately avoided paying the debt that's a result of a product that was applied for, or has acted fraudulently in relation to obtaining that credit. It's more serious than normal just because it could suggest that the client also left their last known address without giving the creditor a forwarding address, couldn't be contacted after the creditor made reasonable attempts, and off the back of them intentionally failing to meet their obligations. So we'll just go through it now and have a look to see what would be checked when assessing all of this. So we want to see if the listing in question would be expiring within 60 days. If it is, we wouldn't go ahead and work on it. We would just expire that within our system. We'd want to also have a look to see if the creditor has a credit license. So if they were licensed to even issue credit, which would null and void the listing itself. So we'd check yes or no. And there's a fact sheet there and links where you can find the business and if they have a credit license and whatnot. The next point here is if the creditor is a member of a recognized EDR scheme. So this would be an ombudsman, for example, AFCA. We'd want to check to see if that is the case, if we need to look at any possible escalations. This one's stock standard and applies to most listings. That's if the client had experienced domestic violence leading up to or contributing to the serious credit infringement. And also if they believe that the listing is a result of fraudulent activity commenced against them or ID theft. If so, then there's relevant paperwork within our systems we get the client to complete before contacting the creditor. The next one is if the creditor has, if the creditor has accepted our privacy consent form, and if we can continue sending correspondence backwards and forwards at that point, or if we'd need to assess it and get an updated or corrected PCF or privacy consent form. The next point here for all listings is if the creditor has provided all documentation that we would request that has to do with the serious credit infringement, which is statements, contracts, interaction notes, repayment history, and notices, and also notices to do with possible field agents visiting a client address for the contact of trying to collect debt, things like that. There's a hyperlink here which would go into a bit more detail of that. So we'd click yes or no if the creditor had provided all of these things or if we needed to request some more from themselves. This one here is if the debt is statute barred. There's a link here with statute of limitations because that's dictated and differs depending on the state that it issued that. So we check that off, yes or no. Has the client suffered from circumstances beyond their control? That's something that we would usually ask the client before going ahead with everything. And yeah, we'd raise that in our first letter that we'd send out to the creditor. We'd also check to see if the client was affected by COVID-19 at all. Yes or no. That's pretty straightforward. This one here is asking if the client benefited from the account. So if this was something that was taken out in their name, if it was something to do with a business, we'd want to know if it was something that they actually used or obtained and benefited from. And there's a bit more detail and information in that hyperlink there to explain the ins and outs of that when going back to a creditor to raise those issues. This one here is checking to see if the client was contacted by their preferred method of contact. So, as I said, with the serious credit infringements, if a creditor is stating that they deliberately avoided paying a debt or acted fraudulently in relation to collections or payment for the debt that was due, we want to make sure that if they've said, hey, my contact details have updated, please use this, and they were using an old number, hence why they couldn't get through to them, or if they said, please only send it to a mailing address, and they haven't done that. They've only tried to call the client, but the client is in a rural area and doesn't get reception, all types of things that could affect a preferred method of the client's contact. We'd need to check that off, and that would usually be outlined in interaction notes between the creditor and the client. The next thing to look at would be if the client consented to the disclosure to do with the actual application leading to the listing, and that's all outlined here. Has the creditor rejected the privacy consent form? Well, that's pretty much similar to this question here. We'd pretty much outline that up here. So again, we'd just check off yes or no, and there's a link there in the hyperlink to see the credentials of why they would reject a privacy consent form. Is the client disputing liability? Again, that would be more to do if they benefited from the account, and just a bit more detail of that. If it was something that, if they were business partners and someone had left the business and appointed it to another person, then it would be either a yes or no if that was something to do with that. And there's a hyperlink there which would go in a bit more details of how that would work. This one here is stating, did the creditor skip trace, send notices via email and mail, plus try contacting the client via phone? So skip tracing is basically where the creditor would make efforts to try and locate the client. So looking through white pages, Google searches to see if there's a business entity that's related to the client, things like that, to try and get a hold of them and track them down, basically. And then that's outlined here with notices and things that were sent out via phone and mail, things to do with that. Is the serious credit infringement recorded over $150 to do with default amounts? We'd just basically check to see if that was the case or not. Was the debt over 60 days in arrears prior to the default? So if there was any payments or collections that were successful within that 60 days prior to the default being listed, then that will affect if the serious credit infringement should have been listed, or if there should have been some other avenues that they would have approached, allowing a bit more time before it led to that. And then it's obviously explained in more detail in that hyperlink there. Also wanting to check to see if those notices that were sent out are compliant. So if the time frames between the previous notice is over a certain amount of time, and if the amounts on those notices are matching what's listed, and if the client's address is correct where they were being sent, and the name of the person that's on there. Again, there's a checklist, sorry, a hyperlink here for the checklist that goes into all of those details. Again, we check to see if there's any hardship that affected the client, which we would raise when going back to negotiate or dispute the listing. Was the debt listed after a bankruptcy is the next point here. If the client had entered into a bankruptcy agreement and the serious credit infringement was listed after, we'd want to assess if it should have been included in that bankruptcy agreement. So we'd check yes or no if it was the case, if they had been in a bankruptcy. We'd also want to look to see if we could identify in interaction history from the creditor if they had misled the client in any way. So I'd say more to do with if a payment was due and there was evidence that they'd said they have a certain amount of time to pay it, as a payment extension, and the client hadn't paid within a certain time, and they said that there was no extension, things like that. Or if there was a settlement amount, a client had paid a certain amount less, but then there was still a remaining balance owing after that. There's a whole lot of variables with that. And we just have a general review to see if the client was on board and on the same page with everything that creditor was letting them know. The next one here is the account paid and closed? If so, we want to see if it is reflecting on the credit report, and there's a bit here saying paid but not downgraded. That link will go into a bit more detail of that. So moving on to the next one here is, did the creditor adhere to debt collection guidelines when contacting the client or third parties? So that can be to do with making contact via phone within a certain time of the day. I believe 7:30 for most states is the earliest, and then after 8 p.m. at night is the latest that you can call. So if there's evidence of the creditor making calls outside of those timeframes, especially, for example, if there's a time discrepancy between New South Wales and Western Australia, just things like that. And there'll be all of the details of those timeframes and methods here in that hyperlink. The next one here is saying if the client struggled within the first 6 months to make repayments, that would be based on responsible lending. So if the creditor had given the client a product that wasn't suitable for them in terms of what they were earning and what they would be able to pay back, it's not likely that the client would have been able to make the payments. So it's kind of not responsible lending on the creditor's behalf to give them a product that would most likely lead to any kind of negative impact on their credit score. And we'd look through those guidelines to assess if the client's financial circumstances changed, or if they'd remained the same, and it is something we can raise to do with responsible lending. All right, second last one here saying, did the creditor abide by responsible lending guidelines? Again, that's pretty much going to be a similar thing that you'd look at with this one here. As you can see, it's the exact same hyperlink, and that's pretty much covered there, except it would be looking at things other than the first 6 months of obtaining an account, and more to do with, as I mentioned, the client's income changes, that type of thing. And lastly, did the creditor respond within 30 days? If they are a member of an EDR scheme, we can look at escalating the matter if we've sent a follow-up after the first 30 days and if they're just not responding. Otherwise, we would just send a follow-up. And that's pretty much everything that you would need to consider using the checklist for serious credit infringements.